The Monroe Doctrine is one of the cornerstones of the American foreign policy. It was enunciated by President James Monroe in his annual message to Congress on the 2nd of December, 1823. In his message, President Monroe categorically stated that America was for the Americans and America would diligently follow a policy of non-colonization and non-intervention. James Monroe was not a very daunting and awe-inspiring president like his predecessors, but he was a nationalist to the very core. His nationalist concerns led him to accommodate the principles drawn by his dynamic Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. In fact, it was John Quincy Adams who drafted the Monroe Doctrine, and it was put before the President James Monroe for approval. When the Monroe Doctrine was first announced, it was merely a message. Later, it was indoctrinated into the foreign policy affairs of America. Since its inception, the Monroe Doctrine has never remained static and has been subjected to occasional redeployment of meaning and definition. It would evolve over the years, crystallizing towards the end of the 19th century. Dexter Perkins in his paper read at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association held in St. Louis, Missouri on the 29th of December, 1956 said that in the foreign policy of the United States, the principles of the Monroe Doctrine are deeply rooted and conveniently labeled. Professor Palit has compared the personality of John Quincy Adams with James Monroe.
James Monroe was not a very striking personality, but his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, was a dynamic intellectual of the day. John Quincy Adams mostly drafted all his policies, including this Monroe Doctrine, which goes in the name of James Monroe.
The Monroe Doctrine had its origin in the farewell speech of George Washington in 1798, in which he categorically outlined America's future policy. Why, by interweaving any part of our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? Thomas Jefferson reiterated the same words of Washington when he wrote to Thomas Paine, "We shall avoid implicating ourselves with the powers of Europe. They have so many interests different from ours that we must avoid being entangled in them." Dr. Palit narrates to us the context of this policy.
After the War of 1812, there was no further war for the time being, and United States was doing homework for the safety and security of its democracy. Its policy was mostly concerned with domestic problems. Foreign policy was in the backstage. But then certain things cropped up on the international horizon near the shore of United States, for which this announcement of policy had to be made. On the other hand, there were the series of revolts in South America. The South American countries under Spanish rule, like Bolivia, like Peru, then Argentina, Chile, had risen in revolt under their able leaders. And the quadruple alliance in the continent, they wanted to support their partner, Spain, in maintaining their empire in the Latin Americas. Spain was, as you all know, the power over these aspiring Latin American countries. They even had planned to send a joint contingent of troops to the New World to suppress all these rebellions in Bolivia or Peru or Chile or Argentina. This was also a great threat to the safety and security of the United States. And if the old powers of the old world would come to Latin America, they would surely knock at the door of United States as well. It was not very far off. That was the chief concern of James Monroe. He at least wanted to see that American democracy was safe.
James Monroe made 4 basic provisions in his message while declaring that the Old World and the New World had different systems and must remain distinct spheres. Dexter Perkins, the author of the book The Monroe Doctrine and its greatest exponent, had sought out the provisions of the doctrine in 2 parts. The first 2 provisions are considered as the affirmative provisions and the next 2 provisions as negative provisions.
Now, these are the 4 sets of provisions. In the first 2 affirmative statements, we still see that there are some bellicosities, some kind of assertion of power. As if American colonies were subjected to colonization, or if the political system of the continental powers was grafted on United States, they were going to take action. The second of the negative set was that the America never intended to colonize any part of the world. It was never its policy. It will not be its policy even in the near future. So America would not colonize. America was a land of democracy, and therefore America would not like to colonize any other part of the world. America wanted to grow as a democratic country in, to quote, splendid isolation. Now, splendid isolation or salutary neglect are phrases used by Edmund Burke in his speeches on conciliation with America at the time of the American Revolution. But this spirit was carried by James Monroe or his foreign minister, John Quincy Adams, in the year 1823.
The speech made by President Monroe in 1823 in a Congress session acquired the status of a doctrine over a long period of policy formulation and improvisation. The doctrine was, however, put to cold storage after Monroe's presidency. The next president, John Quincy Adams, did not think it to be indispensable enough to rely on it for his foreign policies.
John Quincy Adams did not require this document to be revived or used for diplomatic purpose. It was not in his diplomatic arsenal. And somehow or other, the continental powers had not thought it fit to once again intervene in American affairs. So America really could enjoy this salutary neglect from the continent. During this era of good feeling, say, for about 15 or 20 years, we can say, for next 20 years, United States had this program of inward expansion undeterred by foreign powers. And this really led to their expansion towards the southwest. Particularly, this was the period when the Texan question came up. Gustavus Austin, an American explorer, found out Texas and thought that this was a good place for settlement. An American population, the ever-growing American population, was moving towards Texas. It was not just that Americans had populated Texas, one territory, but they also populated other territories like Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, California, all under Spanish rule and particularly under Mexican control. And naturally, to protect their own people, the American government had to take some action against the Mexican government, who wanted to contain the revolt of these American immigrants in Spanish territory. At that time, the President of the United States was James Polk, P-O-L-K. Polk was actually a jingo, expansionist in his bones, and therefore he would have a fight with the Mexican government at all costs to protect the interests of the Americans who had gone in there. So James Polk thought that this is an ideal situation to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, which was by then forgotten. So in 1846, we see James Polk reviving Monroe Doctrine from the archives. And the same principles, in so many words, were again stated by James Polk in his announcement of foreign policy. And with that kind of announcement, he saw the magic results. Once again, all the continental powers, they desisted from any kind of intervention. They just looked on when United States took up its fight against Mexican government. The Mexican government did not get any kind of support from the home government, that is from Spain, and it became an insular war without the intervention of any of the continental powers. In this fight, we know that this is called the Mexican War of 1846. In this fight, Mexico was beaten, black and blue, and United States was victorious. A treaty had to be signed immediately after this war, and by this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, United States claimed that all the territories on the border, that is beyond Latin America, must come to the American Union. And in this treaty, she claimed that not only Texas, which had already been converted into a republic and already had annexed to the American Union, but also other territories like, as I said, like Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, all would be now annexed to the American Union. So America had a tremendous expansion towards the southwest and became wealthy and powerful because of the new acquisitions. That was the net outcome of the Mexican War of 1846. So here also, as I would say, that the Monroe Doctrine worked wonders. Russia also didn't dare to enter into Alaska. And somehow or other, the Monroe message or policy or doctrine, whatever you call it, acted as the safety valve for the United States. By uttering the same doctrine that Monroe himself had done in 1823, America reaped good dividends. Meanwhile, a lot of changes have taken place in the New World. Americans had resolved their internal conflict by the Great Civil War of 1860-64, and the blacks had been set free. They now spilled over to the entire continent. America passed through two revolutions, one after the other. The first was the agricultural revolution, in this kind of a freer economy of cheap labor and abundant land, and then an industrial revolution. There was an overwhelming growth of manufactured commodities, and United States domestic market was not enough for that, and therefore they wanted to expand into newer territories. Therefore, they were out for colonization. Though originally Monroe had said that America would never attempt any colonization of any other part of the world in 1823, now this was abandoned. Since Cuba was very weak, America had meanwhile built up a huge army and a very strong navy, and she really was itching to show her power, that they could smash a giant continental power with a fist. But really they simply wanted to replace the Spanish authority by American authority. So in this way the war started in 1898, and it was a short war of 72 days in which United States grabbed Cuba and spread to Samoa, Haiti, and even Philippines ultimately. All these were Spanish possessions. Spain was a weak power of the continent, and America had become a giant power and had a lot of economic ties with the other continental powers, particularly Britain, and therefore this was the season for their expansion. And all these things were done in the name of the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine was revived. This is the second revival of 1898. Now put to a different kind of use. No longer for protection or defense of America. Now it was for offense of America. America became a big brother to all the neighboring countries, whether it is Latin America or Canada or Alaska or wherever. They posed as a big brother, and they cordoned off what they called the American New World Zone. Whitaker in his book on Monroe Doctrine said that this was a new world philosophy. And Monroe Doctrine was seen as that kind of a doctrine which would safeguard peace, prosperity, democracy in the New World. The Americans utilized this to threaten the continental powers, not to interfere in the Latin American countries, particularly in the Central America, where the British had some interest. The British had some interest in Honduras, in Yucatan, and other places in some part of Mexico also, in Central America. British Guyana, in all these places, UK had some interest, and UK wanted to fish in the troubled waters. And to ward off the British, Monroe Doctrine had to be revived. So Monroe Doctrine was now announced by a much more bellicose president this time. It's not James Polk, but it was Theodore Roosevelt, who was, everyone knows, annexationist. He enunciated the Monroe Doctrine in a new light, that any interference by the continental powers in the New World, now New World, they are not saying in the United States, they are saying any interference of the continental powers in the New World, including Latin American countries and North American countries, will be tolerated by the United States. Now language is tolerated. America would take military action against such interventions.
The new position that Theodore Roosevelt was undertaking when he decided to subtly alter the character of the Monroe Doctrine was expressed in what he considered to be the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was stated before the House of Congress in 1905. By this, it became clear that the United States, which had once attempted to create a situation in the Americas where all the independent states of the Americas could undertake a liberal and forward-looking independent policy of their own, was now at an end. The United States now considered that the United States itself was responsible for the well-being as well as the wrongdoing of all these Latin American powers, and it stated as such. It was, to use an unfortunate phrase, going to act as the big brother to practically everybody. This particular change in American foreign policy, which was an infringement of the original spirit of the Monroe Doctrine, was also to be paralleled elsewhere, where America became a colonial power. It was under Theodore Roosevelt that the United States, for instance, expanded into the Philippines. This was also an aspect to foreign policy that the United States had initially rejected when it enunciated the Monroe Doctrine. So the changes that came with the corollary indicated a wholesale series of alterations which placed the Monroe Doctrine in a wholly new framework.
This was going on, and until they entered the First World War. In the First World War, however, United States supplied all money, men, money, material. But when the Versailles Conference was held in 1918, United States had not much of a role to play. The continental powers grabbed all territories and all opportunities in the old world among themselves. And United States did everything for the success of the Allied bloc. But she was left in the cold. Woodrow Wilson, who had been the American president at the time, went to the Treaty of the Versailles Peace Conference. He had no role to play. He had no share of the spoil. Then he announced the 14 points, principles of democracy and self-determination for all the smaller countries of the world in the name of democracy once again. But then nobody listened to him. Uncle Sam had to go back without any kind of achievement. 14 points were rejected by the continental powers in the peace treaty of Versailles. Then at that time America was very bitter and thought that they would not come back to the world scene anymore, and again went back to this old policy of dribbling out territory from the neighbors. All the time they thought that they were doing all these things for the safety and security of American democracy. They thought in terms of Western Hemisphere, as Whitaker has said, and where they would rule as the supreme power, and they would not bother about their head anymore for the old world and their wars. So that was the situation. At this stage, we can think of two conventions we can mention. One was the Montevideo Convention in 1937. There was another convention which took place in Greenland, where the Pan-American countries had met. And they pointed out that they also wanted to grow up independently. They did not need the protection or tutelage of America anymore. So there was an inner revolt in the Western Hemisphere against the big bossism of the United States. So we have these conferences which rejected the Monroe Doctrine. It had become an outmoded idea. Now America couldn't sustain the Western Hemisphere idea anymore. Now the smaller countries, neighbors, over whom they had dominated for such a long time, refused to be dominated anymore. They asserted their independence. So in these two conferences, 1937 and 38, the entire idea of the Monroe Doctrine was rejected. Western Hemisphere idea had been rejected. There was a spectacular decline of the Western Hemisphere idea. But we can say that the United States had by then become a big world power. So therefore, they also wanted to get out of the shell of Monroe Doctrine. They rather wanted to occupy the world stage as one of the major players in the world diplomacy.
So exactly when do you think Monroe Doctrine changed its stance from isolation to expansion?
Yes, I would say that when United States became internally very strong, when it had already staged both agricultural revolution and industrial revolution and had amassed material wealth backed by military preparedness, it switched on from isolation to expansion, as was vivid in the Spanish-American War of 1898.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, when do you think the philosophy of the New World will lost in the Monroe Doctrine?
there was a philosophy behind the Monroe Doctrine, which was keeping the world safe for democracy, securing freedom of the common people, pursuing peace. These were the hallmarks of the philosophy of Monroe Doctrine. It was called Western Hemisphere idea by Whitaker in his book. But this had a spectacular decline when we see that all these philosophies were not practiced by United States anymore, and we can say that from the First World War onwards, or more correctly from the Spanish-American War of 1898 onwards, United States had abandoned its pursuit of democracy, peace, freedom of other people, all these lofty ideas, and itself was becoming one of the world powers at the expense of weaker nations, not only around the New World, but across the world, so to say. So this is the time. We can say that in the interwar period, Monroe Doctrine was philosophy of Monroe Doctrine was totally abandoned, and it became just one of the expansionist policies of the world by a newly arrived power of the world.
In this episode, we discussed the process of gradual metamorphosis of the Monroe Doctrine. It all started with the Monroe speech in the Congress of America on the 2nd of December 1823, which gradually took the shape of a major policy statement. A thorough assessment has also been made in this program to help the students get a fair idea about the doctrine, its negative and positive aspects, and its applicability in the present situation. It talked about how the doctrine acquired different shape and meaning under different precedents, from Monroe himself to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Finally, it discussed the role played by the changing political and economic scenario of America in its process of transformation.